I hope everybody's having a great weekend. I was visiting my dad, and I had a great time. Had a lot of great food at a friend of his house. And I would like to talk right now about something I was reading about at his house. He had these leaflets that he takes that he's very concerned about Middle East affairs and whatever. My dad happens to be, oddly enough, he's more right wing on Israeli issues than he is about American issues, and I'm kind of much more in tune with American politics than he is. And with Israeli politics, I've kind of stepped away, and I don't really know if I would even vote if there were elections there, if I lived there again. But there's really an issue right now that I think is going to become a problem for several factions of the American public. Now, I don't know how clear data is yet about whether American citizens support Palestinians more, Israelis more, or they don't support neither. I would say that there's a much larger proportion of people that don't care either way than is being let on. It's almost as if you were to ask people from Baltimore whether they support the Yankees or the Red Sox. There are a lot of people who will probably say, well, in reality, I don't really think I have a stake in this conflict. And the truth of the matter is that I debate a lot with more people on the Israeli side who try to say, well, this is a really big issue. America should be really very involved in it. I say, no, we've been involved way too much in the Middle East. I think that it's much, the issue would resolve itself much better and to the benefit of both parties if the U.S. was less involved in the Middle East. And for that matter, if other countries were less involved in the Middle East, whether it's Turkey or Russia or Syria, involved in these proxy wars. Iran, I think I meant, not so much Syria. And, there's no way to make anyone happy. There's no way to make people on the Israeli side happy because a lot of Israelis are very polarized as well on the left or the right. On the Palestinian side, there's a very, very small part of the public that actually believes in a peaceful solution anyway. So, and by the way, that goes also on the Israeli side. So you could say that you have two unwilling partners to a peace process that's been a failure. I can remember that in the early 90s, I was very young. I had parents who they obviously they had a great stake in it, having been from Israel. And there was a general sense of euphoria that there was the possibility of a final peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, possibly leading to a total end of the Israeli-Arab wars. And it's been 25 years. That hasn't happened. And in fact, it's actually gotten more and more remote with the passage of time. So the Israel Victory Project is basically this. It's an acknowledgement of that, but it isn't an acknowledgement that objectively looks at it as if both sides should get something out of it. So since its launch in fall 2016, the Israel Victory Project has met with 51 members of Congress with their staff laying the groundwork for a Congressional Israel Victory Caucus. More recently, the project has advised key officials of the Trump administration on the concept of Israel victory and its requisite policy. Specifically, we explain, 1, why the peace process failed, 2, the necessity of victory to end wars, 3, how Israel can win, and 4, how U.S. policy can support Israel victory. So this is a plainly both biased and I think it really does show people that are skewed to one side. It's not even making any bones about it, and I'm saying this as someone who is not anti-Israel. I would say that this is plainly trying to get the U.S. administration to support a solution that's amenable to the Israeli side. Okay, I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's a fact. 1, the peace process that failed. When the Palestinians lived under direct Israeli control before the 1993 Oslo Accords, acceptance of Israel had increased over time even as political violence diminished. So I'd like to know what the polling data for that was. Residents of the West Bank and Gaza could travel locally without checkpoints and access to work sites within Israel. They benefited from the rule of law and a growing economy not dependent on foreign aid. Functioning schools and hospitals emerged, as did several universities. So I would say some of that is not exactly true. There were checkpoints. There was a degree of state intrusion on the lives of people, and you could say intimidation. There were arrests because there was an active resistance movement going on within the West Bank and Gaza. So for them to say, well, it was very good over there, I would say it's better than it has been since the Oslo Accords. But you can never. This is the problem I always have with people on the right as well. A lot of the people on the right try to say that the 50s and 60s were a great time to be an American, even if you were black. I would say if it was so great, nothing would have changed because nobody would have fought to change it. I would say that the the way that the society has changed since then hasn't made it better for those people in a certain sense. If you're talking about poverty, if you're talking about urban areas, so that I take the same approach here. What they're trying to say is that the Oslo Accords ruined almost an idyllic situation over there in the West Bank and Gaza, but that's just not a fair assessment of history. Because even if people have better economic conditions, and I do believe they did under the pre-Oslo Israeli control, it does not mean that they felt that they lived in a free and just society. And you can't claim that it was a free and just society. So I'm not saying this in order to indict the Israeli side or be kind of a champion of the Palestinian side. But I'm disputing what these people are saying from the Israel Victory Project because they're trying to make the case that it was a much better situation under the Israelis prior to Oslo, to such an extent that it's ridiculous that they would have tried to change it. No, there's obviously a reason why people decided to make the gamble for Oslo, and I would say that this is historic revisionism, just in the same way the left makes historic revisionism, that they would try to say that Israel not existing would have been a great situation for the Middle East. Well, the Middle East has been at war for centuries and millennia with no connection to Israel. Okay, the Ottomans, before the Ottomans, there were of course the Crusades and the Muslim conquests or whatever. So people like to idealize their their era of history or the part of history that they think best represents society as it should be. It just never is as good as it's represented, and it's hard to be fair because then you get attacked by both sides. Oslo then brought Palestinians not peace and prosperity, but tyranny, failed institutions, poverty, corruption, and a death cult, suicide factories, and Islamic radicalization. Oslo gave traction to the hitherto recessive Palestinian hope to eliminate Israel, so that became dominant by 2000. Venomous speech and violent action soared. So I think a lot of that is accurate, and you'll see why after this, because this is while the Israel Victory Project exaggerates to a great degree how much better it was under the total occupation than it was under the Palestinian Authority. You do have to recognize the failures of the Palestinian Authority, and I'll bring a source to validate that might surprise some of you, because I have mentioned it before, so some of you may already recognize this source. As Palestinian rage spiraled upward, more Israelis were murdered in the 5 years post-Oslo than in the 15 years preceding it. Further, Israel lost standing internationally as its legitimacy declined, especially on the left, spawning the UN World Conference Against Racism in Durban, Hate Fest, and the BDS movement. For Israel, 45 years of successful deterrence, meaning before Oslo, were substantially undone by 7 years of Oslo appeasement, 1993 to 2000, and 7 years of unilateral withdrawals from 2000 through 2007. And then, too, the false hope of finessing victory. Israeli concessions have inflamed Palestinian hostility. The Israeli effort to make peace was received as a sign of demoralization and weakness. That is true. every time they do make a concession, the Palestinians and their supporters make it seem as if it's this show of weakness, painful concessions, and that is the phrase that was used by the Israelis, which would mean, giving up lands and giving up, and often releasing prisoners, reduced the Palestinian awe of Israel, made the Jewish state appear vulnerable, and incited irredentionist dreams of annihilation. The word irredentionist is not used very often in everyday society, but it means those people who typically want a complete restoration of a previous phase of history. So a lot of the people who believe that the U.S. Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, and California belong to Mexico, and they're trying to return it to Mexico, that would be an irredentist movement. That's by definition. It's not saying irredentism is wrong or right, but that's what that means. Wars generally end when one side in a conflict gives up hope, when its will to fight has been exhausted through defeat. In other words, wars end not through goodwill, but in victory. Victory consists of imposing one's will on the enemy, compelling him to give up his war ambitions. Defeat can result either from a military thrashing or from an accretion of economic and political pressures. This does not require total military loss or economic destruction, much less the annihilation of a population. So that's an important thing to throw in, because this I think is kind of a bit of a jingoistic document, and jingoism is kind of an epithet used against nationalist movements, but this is for sure, this is a document that is justifying the Israeli side all the way and kind of detracting from the legitimacy of the Palestinian side. But I think this disclaimer is important, because the idea of advocating for the annihilation of a population would make this document, in my mind, completely unacceptable. Because you can't make a public policy of that and then expect the world to look at you as some sort of state that is equal on an ethical basis with the rest of the world. Now, then again, there are states that do commit genocide and nobody cares all over the world. I would say the most egregious example would probably be Sudan, that they were committing genocide on a massive scale, genocide on racial and religious basis. In Nigeria, it's not, I don't believe it's state conducted, but there is a religious and ethnic genocide going on over there too. Now, those are examples where those countries are simply ignored because people don't care about them. Again, like I don't know how many times I have to emphasize it. There are states where there are things going on that are much worse than what's going on in Israel and Palestine that nobody talks about. And nobody will talk about, because the issue here is not being humanitarian and believing in justice. The issue here is virtue signaling in favor of a cause that's popular among a certain sector of the political spectrum. Thinkers and warriors through the ages concur on the importance of victory as the correct goal of warfare. For example, Aristotle wrote, "Victory is the end of generalship." And Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "In war, there is no substitute for victory." Technological advancement has not altered this enduring human truth. So then they go through the rest of it. You can see the document. I'm just going to, I'm not going to read through the whole thing because it really just repeats it again. I mean, the important paragraph is here. Israel victory, ironically, is good news for the Palestinians. I don't know about that. Compelling them to give up their irredentist delusion liberates them to focus on developing their own polity, economy, society, and culture. Palestinians need to pass through the bitter crucible of defeat to become a normal people whose parents stop celebrating their children becoming suicide terrorists, and which prefers to help itself rather than harm Jews. So, I'm not saying that I think the Palestinians are correct. I also am not saying that I think this is good. This is good for the Palestinians, that this project would succeed, because ultimately we can't determine the course of another country's or we can't make other people's choices for them. Unfortunately, they also can make choices that are self-destructive for them. So I think in a certain sense, I would agree strategically on the that the idea to support Oslo was a horrible idea on the part of the Israelis. And in retrospect, it didn't help the Palestinians either, because they're under a worse regime than they had been before. I would say the Palestinian Authority is worse than the Israelis, although the point of this document is to say also that it was much better under the Israelis. It wasn't much better, because if it was much better, then people wouldn't have wanted it to change. The fact of the matter is that the wrong change occurred. And, it was a horrible idea that was, it's like when you try to solve a problem by implementing a solution that actually makes it get worse. So I'm not trying to validate one side or the other's approach, because if I was, then you could easily disprove me by saying, well, how come we still have this problem? Okay, so we'll get a little later to what I think would have been the better solution, or could still be the best solution now. I think that would be a better idea, because why talk about hypotheticals? I mean, I was making fun of last week this article that was claiming it would have been better for the U.S. to have never left the British Empire. I don't think I did it on. I think I just shared it with some people, so it wasn't on this show. But in any case, I forgot I was going to make this private. But anyway, hi, John Sislowski and Gabriel Swift. Thank you very much. Gabriel Swift says South Africa is killing all of the white farmers. That's true. Wasn't Palestine quite liberal and Western in the 70s? No. No, it wasn't. Probably not. Probably a little better than it is now. Now, I will tell you why I think that the Israel Victory Project is gaining support among people on the right wing, both in the United States and in Israel. You see, in the early 90s, like I said earlier, there were a number of people who thought that it was a good idea to engage in this peace process that became known as the Oslo Accords. And gradually, as the landscape became, and by the way, I probably would have counted among those people, though I was pretty young. I wasn't of voting age yet. I didn't even live there. So I was among the people that believed in the peace policies of the 90s. Then as the landscape became bloodier because of terror attacks, this was before the Intifada, and because of basically a lack of trust that quickly developed between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the support for the peace process eroded over time. So in 1992, Israel elected Yitzhak Rabin to be its prime minister. He was the person who brought about the Oslo Accords. He was murdered in 1995 by most accounts by a right-wing fanatic named Yigal Amir. And people thought, well, his death would redeem the peace process, because people would see this as a jump starter for the peace process. Well, what actually happened was that his successor, Shimon Peres, was a supporter of the peace process, but he actually was also not trying to pull back troops from Lebanon. The Israelis occupied part of South Lebanon at the time, and also they were suffering from wave after wave of suicide bombings during this time. So people in the left thought that he was not leftist enough because he wouldn't withdraw troops from southern Lebanon. This was in 1995 to 96, the winter of 95 to 96, because Rabin was murdered on November 4th, 1995, if I remember correctly. So Peres was basically losing a lot of his support on the left, the peace camp, because he still kept his troops in Lebanon and mounted an offensive over there due to some fighting with Hezbollah. Then he loses the election that year because he seemed like completely incompetent. He couldn't manage the war in Lebanon correctly. There was also a wave of suicide bombings under his administration. So he gets replaced by Netanyahu. And Netanyahu at the time was virtually unknown, except he was more known as the brother of somebody who had been killed in the Entebbe operation of the 70s than he was known as a politician. But he came to power. He rules for about 3 years, gets voted out of office by Ehud Barak, who was also a pro-peace camp person. And this was the last gasp of the peace camp, because Barak gave as many concessions as could be done according to public opinion to the Palestinians up until 2001. And the Palestinians rejected it. This was under Yasser Arafat. And basically that failure meant that from then on, the Oslo Accords basically became almost an empty process, because Barak fell from power. Ariel Sharon replaced him. Sharon decided to engage in unilateral withdrawal from parts of the Palestinian territories. So they withdrew from the Gaza Strip all civilian residents, known as settlers. And then also from part of the West Bank, the far northern settlements of the West Bank, a lot of them were evacuated. And that created a huge fissure in Israel, because people on the right wing there said, well, we're getting nothing in return, because this is a unilateral withdrawal. The Palestinian side does not care about what we're doing. Therefore, this is a bad process, and we're going to suffer for it. And lo and behold, after that, this is when all the Gaza issues started. This is when the soldier Gilad Shalit was kidnapped from there, I believe in 2006. That's when I was in the army there. So he was kidnapped from there. And people started to recognize that the process was not going to happen. This was already after Arafat had fallen and his successor, Mahmoud Abbas, took power. Gradually, Hamas superseded the Palestinian Authority central government in Gaza, and they took over the Gaza Strip. And there was a lot of recognition at the time that there was no Palestinian side to negotiate with, because they were they were not united. They didn't have any structural integrity, because they couldn't effectively control their own people. And also there was a dispute as to who really represents them, and there still is a dispute as to who represents them. So let me see. I don't know if you guys are asking any questions. So that I think is what garnered support for this Israel Victory Project. Now, under President Obama, this idea could have never gained any wings, and that's why the Palestinians, in a certain sense, suffer from, I guess, a basic strategic failure, because under Obama, if they would have gone in the negotiating table and hammered out an agreement, they wouldn't have to deal with this right now. And this solution will not be to their liking at all, nothing. It's probably because it effectively means it literally means that they will be spelling out that any peace process that happens must be made on the basis that the Palestinians have lost a historical conflict, including several wars, and that therefore they must negotiate on those terms. The Oslo Accords did not look at it that way. They looked at it as if the two partners were on an equal basis, though the wars were not really the basis for a final status agreement. This is a major change. Now, until now, we've talked a lot about the Israeli policy. Now let's talk a little about why the Palestinian side is probably going to have to deal with something like this. I'm not going to say because it's the right thing. I'm going to say because it makes total sense. This is from July 4th. And they're making it out to be as if this is a sudden change, but it's not. And I'll show you why. Palestinians favor jailed leader Barghouti as Abbas's successor. So Mahmoud Abbas, like I said, is the head of the Palestinian Authority. I'll show a photo of him. So you can see this. This is him. And this is a typical pose of his. He would just rant and rave and shake his fists. But he's been a career academic his entire life. He's not from among the Palestinians that were involved literally in the armed struggle. So that's actually used against him often by his opponents to say, well, he doesn't really represent the people who have actually suffered from the conflict. This is talking from the Palestinian perspective, if you read aloud what they say. And indeed, who's the person that they do support? Marwan Barghouti. And you can see from the photo that there's a little problem with that. A Palestinian uprising leader jailed for life by Israel would win most votes if an election were held to find a successor for 82-year-old President Mahmoud Abbas, a survey released on Wednesday found. The poll was conducted by the Ramallah-based Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, which interviewed 2,150 adults in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. 30% of the respondents named Barghouti a member of Abbas's Fatah faction, whom an Israeli court handed 5 life sentences for murder in 2005, as their favorite to replace the president. Israel accuses Barghouti, age 59, of masterminding attacks by Fatah's armed wing, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. Seen as a pragmatist, he enjoys strong grassroots support and has good relations with all factions, including with Islamist group Hamas. So what you have to understand, and they can't really go into in depth here, is that during the Intifada, the second Intifada, which I served during the end of, there was a certain wink and nod policy as regards to terror attacks. Now, the official Fatah party could not endorse terror attacks outright, but what they did was they first of all they subcontracted a lot of these terror attacks to the rival factions, Islamic Jihad, which is one of the smaller factions, and the Hamas group, which is pretty large due to a very good social welfare network that they run. They run a number of schools and charitable institutions. So they have an armed wing, and then they have kind of a civilian wing that engages in a lot of what you call philanthropic work. That's how they kind of built their support network. So the Palestinian Authority would subcontract a lot of the terror attacks to them. But in order to keep some of the credit to themselves, what they did was form this renegade faction that was it was like kind of unofficially supported by Fatah, called the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. And he was the leader of it. You know, they had a militia called the Tanzim, and they had this group called the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades that they would conduct actual terror attacks, and they were members of Fatah. And then he himself was captured in 2004 and put on trial for the murders of I think 5 Israelis, but there were a number of other ones that he'd also been involved in terror attacks against them. I think there was just evidence enough to convict him of 5 murders. So Israel accuses Barghouti, 59, of masterminding attacks by Fatah's armed wing, the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade. So this line is incorrect. It's not that Israel accuses Barghouti. They did convict him under their laws. So this is a misleading statement. Seen as a pragmatist, he enjoys strong grassroots support and has good relations with all factions, including with Islamist group Hamas. The next most popular candidate was Ismail Haniyeh, head of the Islamic faction Hamas, with 23% support. This is a bit strange. I don't know where it says. Okay, so it's 30% to 23%. So this actually is not very much of a lead. Questions about Abbas's prospects were raised by his 8-day hospitalization in May for what officials said was a lung infection. Wednesday's poll found that 61% of the public want Abbas to resign and 33% want him to stay in office. Abbas became president in 2005 after the death of Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and pursued U.S.-led peace talks with Israel. But many Palestinians lost faith with him as his efforts yielded no gains and talks stalled in 2014. Abbas' democratic mandate expired 9 years ago, so he hasn't faced elections since 2005. With no new elections set due to Fatah-Hamas power struggle that has been exacerbated by Israeli controls on the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So the fact of the matter is that Israel does not control the Gaza Strip, but they control access to it because they're two separated enclaves. So what they really leave out is that Hamas literally does control the Gaza Strip, and Fatah control the Palestinian areas that are under their control in the West Bank. So there's no hope of a good impartial election there, because in one part of the Palestinian territory, one group rules, and in the other part, another group rules, and we're talking about literally institutional control. So it's a major problem. Trilling Barghouti and Hania as Mahmoud and Abbas successors were Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah and former Gaza strongman Mohammed Dahlan with 6% support each. West Bank activist Mustafa Barghouti and former Hamas chief Khaled Mashal with 3% each, and ex-finance minister Salam Fayyad with 2%. The PC-PSR poll found that 48% of Palestinians believe that post-Abbas rival factions would be able to agree on a new election. So that's a plurality of people that think that they could agree on a new election. I'm not so confident in that. 41% they said they did not believe with this. Now, let me explain who some of these people are. Rami Hamdallah is a little more of like a bureaucrat who is almost like a younger version of Abbas. Mohammed Dahlan would be, I don't think that he would really be a, I mean, to be honest with you, Mohammed Dahlan is kind of like a pro-Israeli administrator. So those people who are saying that they would support him are probably, if they did answer honestly, I think that they would hope that the poll is secret, because there would be legitimate grounds to ask, well, does that mean that you actually support the Palestinians being subjugated by Israel? So, and I'm not saying this because I'm disparaging them. I'm just saying that's effectively what that position means. Now, a lot of these people support these leaders due to family ties, due to business interests, due to all sorts of reasons. So you have to read a little between the lines, and it's not always obvious why they would support. Like Khaled Mashal, for example, is a exiled leader of Hamas who has never been in I don't think he's ever stepped foot in the Palestinian territories, to my knowledge. I think maybe decades ago he lived there. So a lot of these people would have weak support because people would legitimately say, well, you haven't been living here for long enough to actually know what we're going through. And that was one of the reasons that the Abbas was seen as kind of a problem. That's one of the reasons that Arafat was seen by a number of Palestinians as detached from the population. That's one of the reasons that Hamas was able to gain support, because most of the Hamas movement organically grew from within the population in the Palestinian territories. Let's see if there's any. Now, on to why the Palestinians might have a little agreement with this. And they're definitely not going to agree openly with the Israel Victory Project, because why would they want to do that? But this is from Diana Butu, and she writes, why the Palestinian Authority should be shuttered. President Trump's meeting this week with the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, was pitched as an effort by the author of The Art of the Deal to restart the United States-sponsored peace process long stalled. But as next month's 50th anniversary of the Israeli occupation approaches, this much is certain: the process is worse than stalled. In the face of an intransigent right-wing government in Israel, which doesn't believe Palestinians should have full rights, negotiations are futile. Where does this leave So this, by the way, was in the New York Times. So those of you saying that the New York Times does not feature the voices of Palestinians should take note. Diana Butu she's a Ramallah-based analyst, former legal advisor to the Palestine Liberation Organization chairman Mahmoud Abbas and Palestinian negotiators, and policy advisor to Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She was also recently a fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. After earning a law degree from Queen's University in Canada and a master's of law from Stanford University, Butu moved to Palestine in 2000. Shortly after her arrival, the Second Intifada began, and she took a position with the Negotiations Support Unit of the PLO. I had mixed feelings about negotiating, Butu said. There is a structural problem with when Palestinians negotiate with Israelis. It's like negotiating with a gun to your head, where the people under occupation have to negotiate their own release. So this is a person who clearly is not sympathetic to the Israeli side, and she gets an op-ed in the New York Times. back to here. Where does this leave Mr. Trump and the American policy of propping up the Palestinian Authority and Mr. Abbas? Given the abject failure of talks built on a bankrupt framework that heavily favors Israel, more and more Palestinians are debating the need for new leadership and a new strategy. Many now question whether the Palestinian Authority plays any positive role or is simply a tool of control for Israel and the international community. Okay, so they're also agreeing that there might not be any need for the Palestinian Authority. The inescapable logic is that it's time for the authority to go. Established in 1994 under the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian Authority was intended to be a temporary body that would become a fully functioning government once statehood was granted, which was promised for 1999. The authority's jurisdiction has therefore always been limited. It is in charge of a mere 18% of the West Bank, divided into 8 areas. Compared with Israel's overall control of the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian Authority's powers are paltry. So this is there's a bit of a simplification. It's more than 18%. The 18% figure is the number of is the territory on which they have both civil and security control. That would be Area A. Area B is another area of the West Bank where they have civil control, but the Israelis have security control. So Israeli police and military patrol there, and the Palestinians have civil control. And then Area C would be the Israeli settlements. So I can actually show that. So you have 23 to 25% is Area B. And let me see here. Yeah, so in effect, they have about 43% of the West Bank is under Palestinian civil control, and of that, 18% of it in total is under Palestinian civil and security control. So I'm not trying to say that it's much better, because for them, 43% is still not good for them. But that was the way the negotiations started, and they agreed to it, and Arafat signed that agreement. And that's just the West Bank, by the way. So it's 43% of the West Bank is under Palestinian civil and security control. Now, the entire Gaza Strip is under Palestinian civil and military control. It's also under complete blockade. So, there's certainly contention there. But if we're talking about control, that's what we're talking. That's the way the figures are. To many Palestinians, however, the establishment of their own government was a dream realized. Finally, those who had lived under occupation since 1967 will be free from repressive Israel's military rule to govern themselves. Palestinians clamored to assume posts in the new body and took pride in establishing institutions despite the obstacles imposed by Israeli rule. As the negotiations dragged on under Oslo, these blocs became only more entrenched. After more than 2 decades, the talks have produced no progress. I spent several years involved on the Palestinian side of the negotiations and can attest to their futility. Palestinian delegates who needed permits to enter Israel to participate in talks were routinely held up at Israeli checkpoints. When we spoke of international law and the illegality of settlements, Israeli negotiators laughed in our faces. Power is everything, they would say, and you have none. And so what she essentially says is very important here, because you can say it's wrong, and you can say it's not balanced, and you can say that it's unfair. But she's actually agreeing, believe it or not, with the Israel Project, the Israel Victory Project. She's saying power is everything, they would say, and you have none. As time went on, it became clear the authority's budget and its priorities were primarily geared toward ensuring that Palestinians remained one of the most surveilled and controlled people on earth. In effect, the Palestinian Authority served as a subcontractor for the occupying Israeli military. So that's kind of a double language. So yes, There were aspects of the Palestinian Authority where they were basically, but that was by agreement. Part of the Oslo Agreement, and she would know that as a negotiator, was that the Palestinian Authority would cooperate on security matters to prevent terror attacks against the Israelis. Okay? That was part of the agreement. If she does not like that, she would have to take it up with President Arafat and later Abbas. Because if she wants this agreement to do exactly what she wants, which means non-cooperation with the Israelis, she would have to tear it up completely and start from scratch. Now, on the other hand, what she fails to mention is that in some cases, the Palestinian Authority would actually fund or supply war materials for Palestinian fighters or terrorists or attackers, whatever term you want to use, to carry out attacks against the Israelis. So she can claim that they were subcontracted to oppress the Palestinians, but on the other hand, they also subcontracted Palestinians to attack Israelis. So what is she trying to prove here? You know, I mean, you could even make a circular argument that Israel supported the Palestinian Authority to create a situation where the Palestinian Authority would attack Israelis and then destroy the peace process. So there you go. I just made up a huge, you know, a donut kind of shape where the Israelis use the Palestinian Authority to attack Israelis and torpedo the peace talks. And you can make the same plausible argument for that. But Diana Boutou would never do that because she doesn't want to acknowledge that the Palestinian Authority was also involved in some of these armed attacks. also in the funding of these people, the funding, you know, the compensation for widows and families, those were all under the behest of the Palestinian Authority. In effect, the Palestinian Authority served as a subcontractor for the occupying Israeli military. The overwhelming focus on security, we were told, was necessary for the duration of peace talks. Well, it wasn't just that you were told, that was the agreement. Today, fully a third of the authority's roughly $4 billion budget goes to policing, more than for health and education combined. These security forces do not provide a normal police service to Palestinians, but instead aid the Israeli army in maintaining the occupation and Israel's ever-expanding settlements. So this is not true. Because the security forces in the Palestinian Authority do not patrol the Israeli settlements. They don't help the settlements. They don't have any authority there. They don't have any jurisdictional reach over there. So this is a huge exaggeration on the part of Boutou. But what she's trying to say, and what she doesn't lay out explicitly, is that their very existence and the role that they play aids indirectly the Israelis in maintaining the occupation. So that's really what she's trying to convey here. She just says it in a very misleading way. The internationally lauded security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority has resulted only in the arrest and imprisonment of Palestinians, including nonviolent human rights activists, while armed and violent Israeli settlers are allowed to terrorize Palestinians with impunity. That also is a huge exaggeration, because there are Israelis, by the way, and I don't know if it's comparable numbers, it probably isn't, but there are Israelis who are detained without a warrant for their arrest. There's basically I remember that there was a such thing as security detentions in Israel, where they would detain you without charge, and they would put you in detention. And I'm talking about the Israelis arresting Israelis, you know, right-wing Israelis, and putting them in detention for weeks on end without a formal charge. So she's not going to complain about that, and in fact, she behaves as if it doesn't happen, but it does happen. Okay, and again, you don't have to take a side in order to acknowledge the facts. Okay, I'll put in what was this person's name? So this is from 2015, allegedly assaulting Palestinians. So he was indicted for it. So this was a leader. This was a leader of the Israeli settlement movement, Baruch Marzel. He was indicted for allegedly attacking a Palestinian man in 2013. According to allegations, Issa Amr was sitting in the courtyard of his house in the West Bank city drinking tea with friends when Marzel entered the courtyard, asked him to leave, and then struck him. Local residents eventually called a nearby IDF soldier to quell the ensuing unrest. According to the indictment, after the soldier left the scene, Marzel kicked Amru in the leg, leaving red marks. Marzel was charged with trespassing and assault. In response to the indictment, Marzel accused police of trying to harm his Knesset campaign. So these things do happen. And for Bhutto to ignore them is simply because he doesn't want to acknowledge that there are people who there's a certain truth to every side of this story. And for her to behave as if there's impunity here, well, I just show that there is no impunity. If they arrest even one person, indict even one person, then that shows that there's no impunity towards the Israeli settlers. The Palestinian Authority has no jurisdiction over the settlers, and the Israeli army almost always looks the other way. Well, no. It has no jurisdiction because the agreement doesn't give them jurisdiction over the settlers. The Oslo Agreement does not give them jurisdiction over the settlers. And it's for her to say this shows that she does not honestly deal with the fact that when you sign an agreement that gives you a disadvantageous position, you can't complain later. Okay, you can claim that it's unfair, but you can't complain later. The raison the reason for her existence of the, I can never pronounce that, of the Palestinian Authority today is not to liberate Palestine. It is to keep Palestinians silent and quash dissent while Israel steals land. Well, you could argue it never was to liberate Palestine. She stated it earlier that the reason for it existing was to negotiate a final status agreement with the Israelis. Demolishes Palestinian homes and builds and expands settlements. Instead of becoming a sovereign state, the Palestinian Authority has become a proto-police state, a virtual dictatorship endorsed and funded by the international community. Look at its leader, 82 years old. Mr. Abbas has now controlled the authority for more than 12 years, ruling by presidential decree for most of the time with no electoral mandate. He has presided over some of the worst days in Palestinian history, including the disastrous decade-long split between his Fatah party and Hamas, the other major player in Palestinian politics, and 3 devastating Israeli military assaults on Gaza. Under his presidency, the Palestinian parliament has become moribund and irrelevant. Many Palestinians have never voted in presidential parliamentary elections because Mr. Abbas has failed to hold them, and even though they are called for in the basic law governing the Palestinian Authority. The latest opinion polls show that his popularity is at its lowest ever, with 2/3 of Palestinians so discontent that they want him to resign. So I'll show you. So let me get to the gist of it. She says, with the negotiation process dead, why should Palestinians be forced to cling to the Palestinian Authority, which has only undermined their decades-long struggle for justice and helped to divide them? Given that there are about 150,000 employees who depend on the authority for their salaries, I am under no illusion that closing it down will be easy or painless. But this is the only route to restoring our dignity and independent Palestinian decision-making. A reformed PLO, with its credibility renewed, will be able to raise funds from Palestinians and friendly nations to support those living under the occupation as it did before the Oslo process. So, behold here, she's effectively saying that it is better. It is better when we waited a long time to get to the point here, and I know it's been 49 minutes already in this discourse, to say that it's in her eyes, and this is bizarre for me to read it, it was better for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, that the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian territories were under Israeli occupation, and they could assist them from abroad than it is having the Palestinian Authority. So effectively, what she agrees to is one of the central planks of the Israel Victory Project. Can you believe that? Isn't that bizarre? And I can't believe it as I'm reading it, but that's what she's saying. She is saying, I'll read it again. But this is the only route to restoring our dignity and independent Palestinian decision-making. A reformed PLO, with its credibility renewed, will be able to raise funds from Palestinians and friendly nations to support those living under the occupation as it did before the Oslo process. So she wants to dissolve the Palestinian Authority and restore the situation to before 1993. To some, this may sound like giving up on the national dream of self-rule. It is not. By dismantling the authority, Palestinians can once again confront Israel's occupation in a strategic way, as opposed to Mr. Abbas's really symbolic bids for statehood. So, in a strategic way, I don't know what the hell she means. This means supporting the community-based initiatives that organize nonviolent mass protests and press for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, like those that helped to end apartheid in South Africa. So what she's saying here is again misleading. Because yes, there was a nonviolent protest movement against apartheid. But people also forget that the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, and other groups that were active in the South African Bush War, as they called it, they were armed groups. They were not peaceful groups. There was a campaign of terror against South Africa during apartheid. It doesn't make apartheid legitimate, but to claim that the whole movement was nonviolent ignores the whole reason that there was a huge military expenditure in South Africa to begin with. So this is very misleading. And in fact, if you look at some of the people who have risen to the top in post-apartheid South Africa, they were military people. Nelson Mandela was I think not as much of a military person, but the last president, the guy who just stepped down, was Jacob Zuma. I think he was. Let me see here. I think he was impeached. I'm not sure if he resigned, but so he became active in Umkhonto weSizwe in 1962, following the South African government's ban. So Umkhonto weSizwe was the armed wing of the African National Congress. Okay, so those of you that don't think that this was a real problem, that this was a real issue, that the South African Bush War was an actual war, don't understand it. They don't understand what they're just whitewashing history. No pun intended. Nelson Mandela was a commander of it. Oliver Tambo, who, by the way, was a very intelligent person, but again, this was an armed organization. It was an armed movement. This new strategy may mean calling for equal rights within a single state, an infinitely more just and attainable outcome than the American-backed process that pretended peace could come without addressing the rights of Palestinian refugees and the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Already more than one-third of Palestinians in the occupied territory support a single-state solution without any major political party advocating this policy. Yes, there is one. They're called Hamas. Hamas has traditionally advocated the total conquest of Israel and the formation of one state. So she's again misleading the audience. By dismantling the Palestinian Authority and reforming the PLO, the real will of Palestinians will be heard. Whether the end game is two states or one state, it is up to this generation of Palestinians to decide. So what have we learned here? We've learned that she believes that the Palestinian Authority must be dissolved, that they should go back to the format of before 1993. But she's playing very shy with what was the actual status before 1993, the same way that the Israeli supporters were, the Middle East Forum. The Middle East Forum tries to claim that the reality for the Palestinians before 1993 was much better because the administration of the West Bank and Gaza Strip was much more humane before the Oslo Accords. That, I think, is very exaggerated. It's just not. It's either wrong or it's simply misleading. And then in her case, she's trying to make the argument, and this is harder to argue with, that the resistance against the Israelis was more coherent and more effective before 1993. So you have two sides that could not be more different in their outlook and their goals, agreeing on one of the more drastic departures from Middle East peace policy that's going around right now, the Israel Victory Project. Now, she's not supporting the Israel Victory Project because she's not admitting that the Palestinians were defeated in wars, but she is supporting a number of the central planks of it, among which are that the peace process was a failure and that the reality was better before 1993. And I find it just baffling. Once again, here's some of the polling numbers. This is from the Palestinian Center for Policy and Social and Survey Research. It holds here that 67% of the public, and this is from 2017, September 2017, and I don't think it's gotten much better since then. 67% of the public want President Abbas to resign, while 27% want him to remain in office. 3 months ago, 62% said they want Abbas to resign. Demand for Abbas' resignation stands at 60% in the West Bank and 80% in the Gaza Strip. 3 months ago, demand for Abbas' resignation stood at 55% in the West Bank and 75% in the Gaza Strip. If President Abbas does not nominate himself in the new election, 35% prefer to see Marwan Barghouti replacing him, while 21% prefer Ismail Haniyeh. Mohammed Daklan receives 9%, 1% in the West Bank, and 23% in the Gaza Strip. Mustafa Barghouti, 5%, and Khalid Mishal and Rami Hamdallah have 4% each. Now, Mustafa Barghouti is a left-wing, non-violent opponent of the peace process among the Palestinians. He's related, I think he's a distant cousin of Marwan Barghouti. Level of satisfaction with the performance of the President Abbas stands at 31%, and dissatisfaction at 65%. Level of satisfaction with Abbas stands at 38% in the West Bank and 20% and 1% in the Gaza Strip. And that also went down. So there's a lot more here, and we've gone on long enough. I want to hear what you guys think. I can imagine some of you will probably not agree with my viewpoint, but look, I want to make something clear. This is not, most of what I'm talking about today is not what Bold Like a Leopard would want. What I'm talking about is what the Israelis are headed for and what the Palestinians are headed for. And maybe Diana Boutou is not speaking for all Palestinians, but it's clear that there's a lack of confidence in the leadership of Abbas. There's a lack of there's basically a lack of movement in favor of the peace process, mostly on the Palestinian side, but also on both sides. The Israeli government does not, I believe, truly want to negotiate with the Palestinians. But there's also they don't believe that the Palestinians are going to actually engage with them. So let me know what your thoughts are. The document links are in the description below. And that's about it. Let me see if there's anybody in the chat. No, you guys, I think, are done. So other than that, have a good night. I'll see you probably later this Sunday. Might have an event at 9 p.m. tonight. I'm going to iron it out. And, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. And as always, be bold.